Oh, death. Oh, death. Won't you spare me over till another year? When God is gone and the devil takes hold, who'll have mercy on your soul? Death. Oh, death. Hello, and welcome to another Dominion 6 National Overview. In this one, we're going to be going over Middle Age Ermor, the Ashen Empire, the reanimated husk of the old Ermorian Empire, who delved too deep into the secrets of death stolen from the Lizard Kings, causing the Cataclysm, and summoning a dark and hungry god whose mere presence is antithetical to life. From then on, the old Empire's lands grew dark as the population died and the lands turned to ash, before rising again to serve the Dark Pretender. The nation of Ermor is different from most others in the game, not natively using races of the living, but instead is full of the undead. Of these types, there are your normal mindless undead, long dead, soulless, etc., but you will also spawn and summon non-mindless undead as your commanders, mages, and sacreds. The nation prefers neutral heat scales, though many of its units also have a chill aura, making cold a decent choice. You also have access to good death magic, as well as some in fire and astral, with some random access to the elemental paths as well. You can also summon anything between Holy 1 and Holy 3 priests, with your priests all able to reanimate the dead, including the living ones, the number and quality of which depends on their holy level. Your dominion kills the populations of provinces that are inside of it. It detects the number of corpses in a province within your dominion, and it will also reanimate the dead in provinces you control. For your scales, you have a death limit of +2 and misfortune +1, and your pretender will automatically start with death 3 scales. You have access to standard forts of the age, with your starting fortress as a citadel. Additionally, you receive 1 death gem per temple per month, which will greatly supplement your death gem income. So let's have a quick look at the undead you'll be using. Well, they're split in two, the mindless and the mindful. The mindless are similar to the regular undead you would see, based on a human chassis. The soulless are the same you would see from Raising the Dead, and you have access to both normal and Ermorian long dead. These troops generally have low HP and poor magic resistance and protection, but you can get a lot of them. The Ermorian long dead also have access to better equipment and skills, whereas your mindful units will generally have better magic resistance and hit points than your other undead, and are very important for protecting your commanders. More on this later. Before we go any further, I'd like to give a quick public service announcement. Middle Age Ermor is a fantastic nation to play. You really do feel like an undead tide destroying the lands of the living by your very presence, but it can be a bit of a slog. In order to move all of your free spawning units, you need to have commanders moving through all of your provinces that are animating the dead, moving the dead your priests reanimated, etc. Every turn is very intensive in terms of what you have to do with all your commanders to play well, and there's quite a lot of plates to juggle at once. Get acquainted with the hotkeys on the army setup screen to make things easier for yourself. Let's first talk a little bit about your Freespawn mechanics. Ermor's dominion will kill the population and then raise them as the dead. The more candles you have in a province that you own, the faster it will kill the population and the more dead will rise. As long as you own the province your dominion is in, Freespawn will spawn there depending on the number of corpses there or alive population in order to join your ranks. While you have population and corpses in that province, the Freespawn will mostly be those that need corpses, things like soulless and ghouls. When there are no longer any bodies to convert, long dead will begin to spawn instead. You get better quality free spawn if you have a fortress in the province. The long dead are more likely to be your Ermorian versions with better equipment. If you have a temple in the province, you're also more likely to spawn in sacreds, the Knights of the Unholy Sepulchre. It's very important for Ermor to get this infrastructure up in your province so you can get better quality free spawn and sacreds. The infrastructure will also help you fend off attacks into your provinces. Players do not like sieging down Ermor. There's no population, so there's no supplies for their armies, and even when they do take your land, it's worthless because everybody's already dead. It's one of the main reasons the community collectively hates having to fight Ermor or other nations like it. So let's dive into your troops. Your national troops are your free spawns and your summons. You can recruit living troops from provinces that aren't your capital, but they will cost upkeep, and you may rapidly come into supply issues due to your dominion and the dying population in your provinces. All of your undead troops are vulnerable to spells that kill undead, things like Banishment, Cleansing Water, or Wither Bones, as well as any large AoE spells that deal decent damage, things like Thunderstrike, Magma Bolts, etc., especially your long dead due to their lower than average HP. So let's start with your first mindless undead that you'll be seeing a lot of, the Soulless. The Soulless will spawn in any of your Dominion provinces that still have corpses in them. They have terrible skills and protection, but they do have decent HP. With their high strength, they do make good fort crackers, and if they hit in battle, they do decent enough damage. The main use for Soulless is to be used as bodies. Their stats make them into big evocation bait for enemy mages or archers, drawing fire from your more important units. They are undisciplined, so it's hard to get buffs on them, though you probably want to use your point buffs on more important units. Their other main role is to annoy you when you're building your armies. Because they're mindless, they can join your squads of long dead, which makes the whole squad undisciplined and lose morale, and then you're very hard to find them in amongst your big long dead squads. Try and assign them to a squad before trying to sort out your other undead free spawn to stop this from happening. Another thing to be wary of is HP routes when using them. Because Soulless have much higher HP than the other troop types that you bring, if you use too many of them to bait attacks and just have them die, it could cause the rest of your army to flee before losing too much of them just because your army's lost too many overall hit points, so be very careful with that. Next up you have your regular long dead. These are what will spawn in every province in your dominion that you control, with more spawning as there are less corpses in that province. I've put up all the potential basic variants that you can get. The main difference between them is their skills, protection, and equipment. Long dead, as a whole, are your line holders in battle, keeping the enemy away from your mages by tarping them up with decently skilled and very numerous long dead. Though you would prefer to have the better long dead make up the bulk of your forces, you're pretty much relying on chance rather than recruitment, so you kind of have to stick with what you get. Looking at some of the better long dead stats, though, they do pretty decent damage with their weapons, and they have cold and poison resistance like most undead. They are poor amphibians, so they can help you expand underwater, and they have decent enough protection. The main drawback to these guys is their HP and magic resistance. A lot of banishments will start to clear these guys out fast without any kind of magic resistance buffs. They do have the advantage, as with all undead, in that they don't have any base encumbrance, so they'll win any fatigue fight against living troops if it comes down to simply attrition, especially if you reinforce them with additional long dead during battle. The trade-off between the sword and spear long dead is that while the spear does less damage, the enemy is less likely to be able to repel your attacks, meaning there's less chance for your long dead to take the one repel damage for following through a repelled attack, which they will do a lot of. Not a big thing to consider, but it is something to think about. You can also spawn Ermorian long dead as well. This will pretty much only happen in forts. These Ermorian versions are, by and large, better equipped than your regular long dead. Starting with the Velity, they're basic long dead but armed with a spear, javelin, and a tower shield. They have no armour, but with their skills and the tower shield they can actually take a hit with it against regular troops, so long as they parry. Their javelins can also help do a little bit of damage before the lines meet, and then they do an okay job at holding the line. They have slightly better magic resistance in comparison to your regular long dead as well, which is nice to have. Next up we have the Long Dead Legionnaire, a souped up version of your armoured long dead with a spear. They also have a javelin and decent protection, especially on their head, though they lose a little bit of defense skill due to their armor. Again, these guys can hold the line better than your unarmored long dead, and they do decent damage with their spears. You just have to be aware of their lower HP per model in comparison to normal humans. You can also summon these guys with an Enchantment 6 ritual costing 15 death gems for 50 of these guys. It's probably not the best practice to use this too often. It's quite costly considering you can get these guys for free. But if you have a lot of Death 4 mages in a besieged fort that desperately need a front line, then this can be a good get lots of tar pitters button. Next up is the Long Dead Principe, who has better armour again and trades his spear in for a sword. Worse for repelling, but actually deals better damage, and he has better skills to boot. These guys do hit fairly hard for Long Dead, and they have marginally higher HP. Mixing them in with your lines to do some work is a good idea, and again, they have javelins to pepper your foes a little bit just before the lines meet. Finally, we have the Triarius, a further better armoured long dead with a long spear, which deals less damage than the Principes, but has a better chance to repel. Nice to have in your lines to help defend you against things like giants or large monsters who can be beaten by repels, though their skills leave a little bit to be desired, to be honest. They aren't bad by any means. Next up we have the Long Dead Horsemen, your basic cavalry force. Both them and the mount they ride are undead, and they're very fast in comparison to your other troop choices. This makes them effective flankers, able to get stuck in against enemy archer or backlines. The combination of mount and rider and their HP means they're more likely to get hit by archer fire or spells than some of your other troops, so having them attempt to kill the mages before they can cast too many spells on them would be preferable. They do have melee protection, and they have okay skills, but they can get the job done. They also have very high map move, to be able to move around your territory quickly to reinforce potential battle sites. Alright, let's move on to your first sacred, the mindless but still dangerous Knight of the Unholy Sepulchre. They and their mount are sacred, with both having decent protection. The rider actually has pretty good magic resistance as well, on top of having a good attack skill with both their lance and their broadsword. Depending on your bless, these guys can actually be pretty scary damage dealers and surprisingly tanky as well, though they still have to worry about banishments due to their low HP, which, with the changes to riders and mounts, does make the rider more likely to die to concentrated banishments than say in Dominions 5, where the HP was on one unit. Still, they have a good charge and a lot of initial attacks that can mop up basic infantry quickly. The main issue with them is they spawn semi-infrequently, making it hard to build a bless around them alone, but they do make a nice supplemental sacred force when you get them. So, looking at your mindless undead, you have some decent enough chassis but with some drawbacks. They're low HP and magic resistance for the long dead, or they're fairly worthless combat stats in the Solus. The main job of your regular mindless undead is just to hold the line for your mages or your damage dealers, things like your sacreds or your cavalry, to do the work. They're mindless, which is great because it means they won't rout, but it does mean that if you lose your commanders, then they'll start to unravel and die. The fact that they're mindless is also a double-edged sword, as it means that any of your less numerous mindful troops are going to be suffering from spells that don't hit mindless units, things such as Mind Burn, for example. So you'll need some ablative mindful troops to stop your undead mages' rotting brains from being made into further soup. This is where your mindful troops come in. The first is the Ghoul, a unit with a stat line pretty comparable with normal humans in terms of their skills and their hit points, and they have no protection, but they do have good morale with some poison resistance, partial dark vision, and the Corpse Eater ability, which gives them bonus HP for every corpse they eat, though that bonus HP wanes after some time after not eating corpses. They aren't particularly great in combat, though they do have a paralysing poison on their claw should it hit, which is nice in that it can paralyse people, I guess. They instead have two main roles. The first is to provide ablative HP against spells that hit mindful units, things like Mind Burn as mentioned before. The second is to provide your castles with siege defense. Mindless units have a massive reduction in their ability to defend in sieges, making it so that your forts are usually fairly simple to crack despite all the undead inside. Ghouls are useful to have inside your forts for this reason. Consider having them on a Reanimator Priest or a Researching Mage. They also make good guards for your commanders to help stop spells that only target mindless things, and with their Paralysing Claw, it only takes one hit to actually stop an assassin in their tracks. Next we have the Lictor, a Freespawn Sacred that can also be summoned at various levels of conjuration for a fairly cheap cost, making them your more reliable Sacred to get good numbers of. They have good skills and stats, they do a lot of damage with their battle axe, and they have good protection and magic resistance, though they are lacking in head armor. They have an inbuilt cold aura to help them in fighting against non-cold resistant troops, and they have good poison and cold resistance, as well as spirit sight. This makes them quite effective in melee, especially in comparison to your normal troops. They do not, however, have any inbuilt magic attack, so they don't fare well against ethereal troops or those with things like Mistform. They are a strong base unit, but they can become even more of a force to be reckoned with if you give them some additional buffs or a bless. Use them as a hard-hitting counterforce for use against tough targets. You can also summon these with the spells Revive Lictor, Lictorian Guard, and Lictorian Legion. Out of these, the most gem efficient is actually the first one, Revive Lictor, using it in conjunction with your national item, the Black Laurel, which we'll go over later. Lictorian Guard just isn't worth it in my eyes anymore. It's too gem efficient now with the changes to the Black Laurel. Lictorian Legion could be useful as a gem dump for lots of sacreds in a desperate defense situation, or if you don't have the mage turns to do multiple Revive Lictors, but at Conjuration 8 is very late in the research tree. So what can we take away from your troops? Well, you have large numbers of basic mindless undead in your armies to use to tar pit your foes, and all of your free spawn cost no upkeep, which is fantastic. While you can take some losses during expansion by using basic skeletons and Solus, as it doesn't financially hurt you, you have to be a bit more careful in larger battles. Anybody who is fighting Middle Age Ermor knows that they'll be against armies made of mostly undead, and they'll bring the counters to them, in terms of priests or death and water mages, or they will try and counter your commanders by using things like Mindburn, Soul Slay, Magic Duel, anything that will counter them rather than your lesser troops. For that, bringing both ghouls and lictors to give them more targets to help protect your mages will help. If you can afford it, you can always supplement your forces with living troops or summons, but don't rely on them too much with your dominion. Let's move on to your commanders. Your national commanders are not recruited. Some will free spawn for you, others must be summoned with death magic that you get at Conjuration level 0, so you'll always be able to summon them, if you have the required paths. This means that you're entirely dependent on death gems to increase your mage core, making them especially precious for you. You do have good access to death magic, with a little in astral and fire and randoms in the elemental paths as well, giving you some nice cross paths. Let's start off with some of your basic free spawn commanders. The Mound King is similar to the one that can be summoned via enchantment. They're useful for you for ferrying around your undead forces, grouping them up to be led by better commanders. They're also useful as they can lead a small number of living forces as well. A good basic commander for your dead, especially given that they have access to advanced formations, and they also give no squad morale malice, useful for your non-mindless units. You can also have access to another Mound King, except this one is on top of a skeletal steed. He shares the same stats as the unmounted version with slightly better defense skill. The main benefit you get from this form is their map movement, making them ideal commanders for your mounted troops to get the most out of them. Otherwise, they still make fine commanders for your regular and mindful undead. The Censor is another potential free spawn, but only in provinces with a fortification. He is not good at leading living troops, but he is able to lead more undead than your previous Mound Kings, though he does have a squad morale malice, making him not quite as good at leading your non-mindless undead. He still has access to advanced formations though. He is also sacred, able to take your bless, but he's not able to bless himself or his troops. In terms of stats, he's similar to your lictors, but with a little bit better magic resistance and a little bit more strength and attack. They can make scary thugs with a little bit of gear, but again you need to watch the lack of his helmet. Unlike your Mound Kings, they are not amphibious, so they cannot go underwater. Let's move on to your mages, all of which you have to summon using death gems. All of them have a chill aura around them, as well as being resistant to both cold and poison. Starting with your priests, all that you can summon nationally are undead, meaning that they can't preach your dominion. Instead, they can reanimate the dead, which I will show for each priest at their holy level. The Acolyte of Eldregate is your first priest, having Holy 1 and requiring Death 2 and 10 death gems to summon. Being Holy 1s, these priests can bless your troops and cast your national holy spells, which we'll go over later. They can reanimate basic dead, but they aren't the best out of all your priests. They're also quite steep in terms of cost, at 10 death gems each, but having one early can be useful in order to get them to build temples in your lands to get more sacreds and to help spread your dominion further and faster, though you could use an independent priest for this role as well. They can lead undead forces as well, though you could probably use your free Mound Kings for this role instead. The Bishop of Eldregate is a Holy 2 priest, requiring a Death 2 ritual that costs 16 death gems. They are better reanimators than your acolytes, and are much better at reanimating the dead, also giving you access to long dead horsemen, though not too many a turn. At Holy 2, they can also cast some powerful buffs on your undead legions, and they have pretty good undead leadership themselves, rolling leader and buffer into one. The Archbishop of Eldregate is a Holy 3 priest that requires Death 3 and 23 death gems to summon. This is a hefty price for a commander, but a summonable Holy 3 is a pretty good deal to be honest. They are also able to reanimate lictors without costing gems, making them able to be even useful in their downtime. They make great leaders for your undead hordes, with their high undead leadership, and they're able to get some battlefield-wide buffs off as well to help your troops. Being able to claim thrones as well makes them versatile commanders for you to use. The Spectator is a Death 2 mage that requires a Death 2 spell and 12 death gems to summon. They're ethereal, stealthy, with a fear aura, and they're okay leaders of the dead. They're useful mages to summon. They're able to do low-level death tasks like making your national item of black laurels or things like skull staff, as well as doing low death magic rituals. But in terms of combat, they're actually outclassed by your next mage, at least until the mid-game before high-level research unlocks big Death 2 and 3 spells, things like Disintegrate or Control the Dead. The reason for this is even though these may be good Horde of Skeleton casters, you already potentially have hundreds of undead in your army, and your foes will be building to counter that, so adding a few more in won't make as much of a difference as it does for other nations, which might not have as many undead as you have out of the gate. The Dusk Elder is a Death 3, Fire 1, Astral 1 mage with a 100% chance for +1 in Fire, Air, Water, Earth, astral, or death, and then a 10% chance for +1 in the same paths. They require a Death 3 ritual, costing 20 death gems. They're ethereal, they're stealthy, they have a fear aura, and they can lead large forces of the undead. These are your prime battle mages, and that has the positives and negatives to go along with it. They have innate access to high death, and they also have a fire cross path. That means they have access to spells like Drain Life, Bane Fire, or Reanimating Bane Fire archers. Their astral path means they can use Power of the Spheres to increase all of their magical paths, making them even more powerful casters, unlocking spells like Vortex of Life, Darkness, Anti-Magic, Rigor Mortis, etc. This does, however, leave them vulnerable to things like magic duels, which they are likely to lose against proper astral mages, or mind hunts outside of battle. Having your 20 death gem mage die to a ritual sucks, so finding ablative astral mages to supplement your elders is a big help. Their cross paths are good as well. Air brings you into Wind of Death territory, water you can use for Stygian Rains, astral for easier anti-magic and boosters, for death you can get bigger rituals and boosters, and for earth and fire you get increased amount of evocations as well as buffing spells. They are very powerful and scary mages. Just be sure to protect them against what they're weaker against. So what can we take away from your commanders and mages? Well, you have a lot of choices for leading your undead hordes. Use your censors for those that don't care about morale, and your Mound Kings for ferrying troops for you, or for your non-mindless undead. Have one of your holy 2s or 3s accompanying them in order to buff up your undead for better results. You should also use your spectators as quick death searchers, and then transition them more into researchers or for low-level rituals and crafting of items, while you instead focus on your Dusk Elders for use in supporting your armies with powerful death magic. Do remember as well that your Dusk Elders and your Archbishops do require Death 3 in order to summon, and you only start with a Death 2 Spectator, meaning that either your Pretender has to be able to cast Sif at Death 3, or you'll have to wait till Construction 5 where you can make a Skull Staff in order to summon your better choices. Let's move on to your national summons. We already touched on 2 of those with your troops, the Lictors and the Ermorian Legionnaires. Before we do go on to the others, let's start off with reanimation via your priests. As your priests get higher holy levels, they're able to reanimate better quality and higher quantities of undead. Making one of your archbishops into your prophet later in the game is an option in order to help you make even more lictors and get them out onto the field. But even having some Holy One indie priests just simply make long dead warriors to boost your numbers isn't a bad shout, though it will eat into your income for getting up other infrastructure. While you do actually have some living people in your population, reanimating some ghouls to help with fortress defense is also a decent choice, though you should really focus on lictors and horsemen with your better reanimators, unless you just need the bodies. The next summon is the Wailing Lady, who can be summoned at various levels of conjuration through the Revive Wailing Lady, Lamentation, and Great Lamentation Ritual. For this, you get a stealthy, ethereal sacred with a fear and a chill aura. They have decent hit points and magic resistance, but they have no protection, an okay defense and attack skill. They're useful for their fear aura as well as their wail attack, which hits an AoE of 1 with an attack that's a magic resistance negates that actually just does 999 damage, killing anything that fails its magic resistance check. This makes these ladies actually surprisingly good at clearing out both normal troops and elites. Eventually they'll fail a magic resistance check and that's them dead. Their main issue is the fact they're now spirit form. Before you could help them by putting something like stone skin or iron skin on them to bump up their protection in case attacks got through their etherealness. Now that's no longer possible. Still, they have their place as a fragile but quite deadly sacred, though they will be less useful when mass banishments start to come online. Taking a reanimator bless with them is quite funny though. I'd recommend it if you've got some free time and you want to laugh. Your last national summon is the Great Lion, who we've covered a few times, we'll go over briefly here. They're decent animals with a multi-attack that do decent damage, though they lack protection and magic resistance. They're also undisciplined, so you can't script them. The main issue Ermor has with them is they require Nature 2 in order to cast, which you have no access to nationally, making them a pretty unattractive prospect to summon. You can use them if you want, but you will start to run into supply issues with them, and your only leader that can really lead them effectively is your Mound King. Moving on from your summons, we have your national heroes, of which you have 4. First we'll go over the Forgotten King, a Holy 3 sacred mage with good undead leadership. A Holy 3 hero is always nice. Not exactly needed given the fact that you can summon them, but getting one for free is always better than spending 23 death gems. Otherwise he's fairly unremarkable, one of your better undead leaders that can still go underwater. The Censor is a sacred commander with a fear aura that can lead a decent amount of undead and alive troops. He has a lot of hit points and a decent attack skill with his axe that deals a whopping 35 damage, capable of bringing down big targets. Could be passable as a thug with some gear, but he has no magic pass to boost it up, or even bless himself. Use him as a leader, or as a potential anti-thug if you get him. Itumi the Wraith King is a Death 3 Holy 2 mage who rides atop a flayed horse. He's ethereal, he has a fear and a chill aura, he attracts shades within your dominion, and he's also immortal. He has a Baneblade built into his kit, making a pretty good thug right out the bat. He has good stats to go along with that as well. Given he is immortal, you can just throw him against your enemies without any gear, with just a little bit of research for spells with things like Soul Vortex, and he can really go to town. You just have to be careful of spells that will kill him for good, Soul Slay being the main ones, or spells that will have him switch sides, things like Control Undead. He also has Spirit Form, which makes him unable to be buffed by spells like Iron Skin to make himself tankier, which is a bit of a shame. Pantokrator the Dusk Elder is a Death 4, Astral 3 and Fire 2 mage. This makes him one of your best death casters, only rivaled by other Dusk Elders with death randoms, and is able to make you a Skull Staff and then a Skull Face to get further up into death, as well as other boosters like Starshine Caps to boost up your Dusk Elders to Astral 2, to try and go for something like the Coin of Meteoric Iron if you have another Earth booster. Good for unlocking cross paths and death and fire, and a pretty good battle mage as well. You only have one national site as Middle Age Ermor, the Unholy Sepulchre, which gives you 9 death gems a turn. These are your lifeblood in the game. You need that death gem income badly. If you lose your capital as Ermor, things are going pretty bad for you. Given that you also get death gems for every temple that you own, and you start with a temple, you'll begin the game with 10 death gem income, which, as mentioned previously, will go up by 1 for every temple you have up to your Dominion score. In terms of national spells, Ermor has the summons that we've already covered, but they also have a completely different divine magic spells to go along with it, rebranded as Unholy Magic. Starting at Unholy 1, you have Unholy Command, which affects one undead at a very short range that will take over that undead and bring it to your side. Though it is magic resistance negates easily, so it's fairly easy to resist. A niche spell, you have other ways of taking control of the dead through your death mages, so this isn't one you need to rely on. Though if your enemy is using undead thugs against you, it does make your Holy One fort or province defense able to potentially take them over when they get close. Unholy Blessing is the exact same as a normal blessing, but it has a much lower area of effect, and it only affects the undead. Unholy Protection gives your undead an AoE of 1 plus 4 magic resistance, which can help them against banishments and other undead clearers. A useful spell to cast, but you can get better use out of the other variants. Unholy Power gives all undead an AoE of 1 plus 1 attack skill and combat speed. This is a game changer for your basic dead, making them far more likely to hit their attacks and make them quite scary in combat. This means that even your Holy 1 priest can be useful in combat as well by buffing up your hordes. For Holy 2 spells, we have a larger area of effect, Unholy Blessing and Protection for Blessing Sacreds, and for giving plus 4 magic resistance. Out of these two, the level 2 Unholy Protection is the most important. This gives you the largest AoE of magic resistance for your undead that's guaranteed to go off, and makes it so that your bishops will be useful throughout the game. For Holy 3 spells, we have a battlefield-wide Unholy Blessing, an area of effect 5 Unholy Power for the increased attack skill and combat speed, and also Protection of the Sepulchre, a battlefield-wide Unholy Protection. The only downside to the Protection of the Sepulchre is the fact that it is magic resistance negates easily, meaning that even though you've cast it, its effect may not hit all of your undead. You can cast it multiple times, however, to attempt to catch those undead that you've missed, but for important undead like your Lictors, Whalers or Knights, you may want to consider using the Holy 2 variant instead to guarantee it. Finally, for Holy 4 we have the Power of the Sepulchre, which is a battlefield-wide unholy power for all your undead forces. This alone makes making an Archbishop your prophet worth it. Plus 4 attack skill on all of your undead troops makes them honestly very scary, especially when you add big death spells in battle on top of it, things like Darkness or Rigor Mortis. Alternatively, you can also go Glamour and Fire on your Pretender in order to make Rings of the False Prophet, turning any of your Archbishops into Holy 4s, making you able to buff any army that you need to. Let's move on to magical research now. What does Ermor want? Well, as one of your first priorities, you actually probably want to get Evocation, and this is a meta reason to be honest, so it's not 100% necessary in single player. In multiplayer, anyone who sees Ermor as a neighbour will likely be quite hostile. They don't want your dominion anywhere near them, and they also don't want you growing stronger, so you have to expect coalitions in early warfare as Middle Age Ermor. By going Evocation, you can make it harder for them to take you over by using liberal amounts of Bolts of Unlife, Shadow Blasts, or Banefires if you can get it. The two former spells won't even affect your own troops, so you can throw them out willy-nilly. If you're not worried about being rushed down, getting levels in construction can be very helpful for both Skull Staffs, Black Laurels, and Reanimation Amulets. Enchantment is also quite important to go down for anti-magic. Anything that you can give your troops to improve their magic resistance so less die to banishments in fights is a massive boon. Alteration is another good path for both Darkness and Soul Vortex, both fantastic spells for you to get. Thaumaturgy for eventually Undead Mastery will make you the king of undead, and Conjuration is nice to be able to get Power of the Spheres and more undead thugs for your arsenal, things like White Lords, as well as diversifying your paths through summons. So what are your research goals as Middle Age Ermor? Well, Darkness is a given. Your undead have Spirit Sight, so they aren't affected by darkness. Casting this will massively reduce the skill difference between your undead and elites, or let them absolutely wipe the floor with regular troops. This obviously only works against those without full or partial dark vision, but anything you can do to make your undead work better will help you in the long run. Rigor Mortis is another great spell for you. It doesn't affect the undead units, which is pretty much your entire force unless you brought some indies in or you're not undead pretender. Making the enemy's army take fatigue damage before the lines even meet is fantastic. It makes your skeletons perform even better due to their enemies dropping defense and attack rolls. Their casters will also get off less spells to clear out your chaff while your mages are doing fine. A crippling spell to use against living armies later in the game. Stygian Reigns is another nice spell to use, especially in conjunction with others. Your skeletons don't want to take a hit, so giving them an invulnerability makes them more likely that the enemy hits will not get through their protection. On the other hand, you don't really care about the invulnerability that you give to enemy units. The majority of your damage will come from your mages with magic damage, or your sacreds like Lictors which do enough damage that they should be able to still punch through the enemy's protection even with their invulnerability. Winds of Death is another great spell for you to use, especially if you combined it with something like a Ring of Returning for one of your Dusk Elders. Having them be able to attack the enemy army with something like this, or even Bone Grinding, can do a lot of work in softening up your enemy's armies before the big battle begins. You do require a Dusk Elder with an AR random for this one, but if you can get it, it's a fantastic spell to use. I mentioned it several times before, but anti-magic is a great spell for you. Just giving your skeletons more magic resistance should never be discounted. Anything you can use to help reduce your losses from mass banishments should be used as much as possible to preserve your horde as much as you can in order to prevent HP routes. Shadow Blast is another great spell for you. You easily have the pass for it, and while you love to use your death gems for summons or items, you can have a couple on standby if needed for the right battle in order to do large amounts of damage to your enemy. If you don't want to use the gems, say if you don't need all of that AoE, then just using something like Shadow Bolt is also fine as well. Power of the Spheres is another fantastic spell for you to use. All of your Dusk Elders are Astral 1, so they can cast this with just one Astral Pearl to make all of their magical paths better, making it so your base Dusk Elders are now Death 4 and Fire and Astral 2. A really nice spell to use to unlock high path spells without having to use your more costly in terms of Death Gem mages in things like Communions. Fields of Death will require a Dusk Elder with an Earth random and a little bit of setup, but having it so the enemy army when killed rises up to fight against them is great to use, especially if it's used in conjunction with battlefield-wide or AoE spells on top of it. Twist Fate and its larger spells are also really nice for your troops. Given that your long dead have low HP, one hit could be enough to put them back into the dirt. Negating the first hit that your plentiful undead troops take will start to take its toll against your enemy, though you may struggle to get to the astral levels to cast the larger AoE spells without some boosters or potentially a small communion. Finally, as always, Terror is another great spell for you to use. It won't affect your mindless undead, but it will make the enemy want to run sooner rather than later. Anything you can use to speed up the fight will help you. It means your forces are going to be hit by less banishments because the enemy front line ran away instead of holding you back away from their priests. Alright, let's move on to some good non-national summons. First of all, we have Reanimate Archers. You're entirely reliant on your mages for ranged firepower, except for maybe your javelins or if you can recruit some indie archers. So having some Banefire archers to help out your forces can be really nice. They're not massively expensive. Only 5 death gems for 10 of them, and you do have the mages for this to be cast fairly easily. It's just a shame your spectators can't do this job, and it has to be one of your Dusk Elders. Pale Riders is another pretty nice spell, summoning quite a lot of skeleton horsemen to help you in battle. It's not as efficient as just reanimating them through priests, but it is fast, and having some more speedy forces to help with your maneuverability in warfare is very helpful for you. Banes and Wraith Lords are also quite a nice choice. They're more generals to lead your armies, and they do actually make for nice thugs, especially the Wraith Lords who are already powerful death casters in their own right. The only issue with them is they're both fairly costly in death gems on a nation that desperately needs them for its mages. Flame Spirits are another option as well. You can easily make a Skull of Fire at Construction 7, which, with a Dusk Elder Fire random, can summon a Flame Spirit. This lets you get further up into fire, as well as giving you more high fire casters in order to surprise your enemies with damage types they might not be expecting you to have the path levels you would have in them. Summon Spectres are great for one reason and one reason only: glamour randoms. Breaking yourself into glamour can be a massive boon for you as Ermor. Spells like Sleep or Slumber are great in combination with your undead. Sending your enemies to sleep means they can't fight back against your undead tide, who can't go to sleep themselves. Additionally, using something like Luck on your Lictors can be very nice to help them survive against banishments. Very nice for the potential paths it can give you. Finally, although it isn't a summon, shout out to Well of Misery. This is a long-term goal as Ermor, but you really need death gems. They fuel your research and your mage core. Getting more death gems means that you can become even more of a contender in the world. Though it's a global, you have to weigh if 21 death gems a turn is worth the ire of everybody else in the game. At 21 death gems though, yeah, that's probably worth it. Middle Age Ermor has one national item, the Black Laurel. A laurel gives additional lictors when used with a Revive Lictor spell. It requires 10 death gems and 2 death in order to craft, so a spectator can craft it for you. When worn while casting the Revive Lictor ritual, it gives you 3 additional lictors for a total of 4. This item is fantastic now. It basically pays for itself with its first cast. Even with just your national sight, you could revive a Lictor 3 times in a turn for 12 Lictors every single turn, and that's not even including things like Priest Reanimators. This means that you can get a scary amount of Lictors very quickly. A really fantastic item to get if you're ever going to be casting the Revive Lictor spell. Now, before we head into the game, let's go over forging items. For research boosters, the Skull Mentor is the big one. For 10 death gems, you get plus 14 research. That's more than a Spectator gives you at 9 research points. When you unlock these at level 5, give them to every single Spectator that you have researching. It's more cost efficient than summoning another one. You do also get access to Lightless Lanterns at construction level 7, which you can make with your Dusk Elders, which will also massively increase your research. For boosters, there are 2 main ones, the Skull of Fire and the Skull Staff for +1 in fire and death respectively. These can help you with forging, rituals and battle magic, especially the Skull Staff. Water bracelets and skull faces will also help, but they aren't necessary for most of what you're doing, especially the skull face, as that's quite a lot of gems. Given the number of reanimator priests you have, having an amulet of the dead on them will massively increase the number of basic dead that you are reanimating. It's up to you if this is worth forging. It does, however, give nearly double to a level 1 holy priest in terms of reanimation for half the cost of an acolyte. It just depends if you're relying on acolytes for your reanimation or if you're recruiting independent priests. The Shroud of the Battle Saint is another option you have. It only needs Astral 1, so any of your Dusk Elders can craft it. This will make either your Spectators or your Dusk Elders sacred, meaning that if you've taken a bless that can benefit them, something like Reforming Flesh, Magic Resistance, or Leadership Bless for example, they can benefit from it as well. Niche in that it will cost you a lot of Astral Gems to outfit all of your Dusk Elders with it, but it's a potentially good investment considering how many Death Gems you have to spend per Dusk Elder. The Ring of the False Prophet is included for one reason. Holy Fours let you give all of your undead on the battlefield +4 to their attack skill and their combat speed. This is a massive buff to all of your basic units, letting them punch well above what they would otherwise. Given that you have summonable Holy 3s, just getting an extra Holy level on them is an option, rather than having to rely on a Holy 3 turned into a Prophet. This will require your Pretender to be designed this way in order to make it, and whether or not you think that's viable is down to you. I include it because I think it's really worth it in the later game. Rune Smasher is another great item for you to grab. A lot of your big spells require beating magic resistant checks on the enemy, so an extra 2 magic penetration can do a lot to help your spells that affect the enemy. Consider combining this with something like an Eye of the Void or other penetration items to get the most out of it. You can craft this by giving a water bracelet and a Skull of Fire to a water random Dusk Elder to improve your big casters. Additionally, this will also help your Archbishops with a battle-wide magic resistance increase for your own troops. The Horror Helmet and the Shadow Brand are good items to give to your Censor thugs, giving them head protection, a fear aura, as well as a way of dealing AoE damage to deal with chaff, with some additional decay for use against thugs. This combined with their chassis lets them be fairly decent army thugs, able to help their forces as long as they have some additional support to bless them and their troops. Moving on to Pretender design. Ermor has a decent selection of Pretender chassis to choose from both the Greek and Egyptian culture group. This gives them a fairly wide selection of a mobile, expander, titan chassis to choose from, as well as your regular Dominion 1 options. For the choice of whether to go awake, dormant, or immobile, Ermor likes to have either an awake or dormant Pretender, for one simple reason: your summons. You start the game with 10 Death Gem income, and no way for you to summon your higher tier Archbishops or Dusk Elders, which severely limits their ability to mass their higher power units early in the game, unlike other nations that rely only on gold rather than magical paths. Having an awake Pretender helps you by spreading your dominion, making it easier to get more free spawn units and territories you take over, and also for helping you by taking incarnate blesses, some of which your sacreds enjoy a lot of. You can take a dormant Pretender if you care less for research and you want a harder bless, but it does leave you vulnerable in the first year from rushes from your neighbours, especially if you have poor expansion, and will mean that your research and your territory could be lacking in order to deal with those threats. Imprisoned Pretenders are really not advised, purely from the fact that you need to get to Death 3 to start summoning your best mages and priests, which now requires Construction 5 rather than Construction 4 for Skull Staffs. It's still possible, but certainly harder to play an Imprisoned God. For scales as Ermor, you really only have a few options. Your best bet is to tank your order, production, and growth skills as much as you can, as well as your temperature skills into cold in order to make your secrets better with their cold aura. This is mostly because you have your inbuilt dominion to deal with. You're going to lose the population within your dominion anyway thanks to that, so you'll lose all of your gold income within your dominion, so why bother paying the design points for good scales? You might as well get the design points to put into a stronger Pretender or a bless. One of the scales you do want to keep up is luck though. Luck can give you income through random events. This is especially true if you tank your order scales. Getting good events are pretty helpful for you. In addition, you do also love magic scales. Your basic undead don't because of the reduced magic resistance, but you will need it in order to have more efficient mages for research due to their gem cost to summon. Unlike some other nations, having a high dominion is also pretty important for Middle Age Ermor. You want to have a high dominion in order to get the most free spawn out of the provinces that you control as you can possibly get. Additionally, you can get death gems for every temple you build up to your dominion score, and at that point you get one for every 5 temples that you make, because that'll increase your dominion score by 1. Let's move on to blesses. You have a few sacred troops and summons, as well as your priests and censors as sacred units, so you have a lot of potential blesses to use. Remember as well that your spectators and dusk elders are not sacred, so they require a shroud to make use of any bless that you have. I'll go over a few of what I think are good just now. Arcane Finesse is a good bless that helps your sacred priests and wailing ladies by increasing their magic penetration. This, in combination with any other penetration items that you can forge, will make it so that your battlefield-wide protection of the Sepulchre has a better chance of affecting more of your troops by making their magic resistance checks harder to pass. Equally, your wailing ladies are more likely to kill as well with their shriek with it. If you make shrouds for your dusk elders, this will also help them as well, especially when casting spells like Rigor Mortis or Winds of Death, making them even more deadly. Reforming Flesh is another interesting option to take. It makes your lictors and priests far scarier. Inbuilt regeneration of 2 hit points per round will make them far tankier, especially against things like sporadic banishments or just general combat. Stygian Flesh is another potential option. Giving your units 10 invulnerability makes them fairly resistant versus normal weapons. Your knights are far tanky for expansion, your lictors become an issue that has to be solved with magic, and it lets your priests survive a straight arrow shot or 2. You will get more benefit from Stygian Reigns later in the game, but this is a nice way to spend some bless points for immediate benefit. Blood Vengeance is another interesting option. You will have quite a few sacreds from either Freespawn or from reviving lictors or reanimating them, so you can actually get a fair number of sacreds. Blood Vengeance gives you a way of potentially dealing with enemy priests casting banishment on you, by potentially harming them for the damage they've dealt to your sacreds, if they fail a magic resistance check. It's a slightly wasted path for your Pretender, however, as you won't really be able to use blood magic, and it is an expensive bless, but it's certainly one to think about. A simple magic resistance bless is also an option. It will massively reduce the number of casualties that you'll take in your sacreds from banishment, and also help protect your casters from mind burns or soul slays. It's fairly cheap as well, something to look at if you're going dormant or even imprisoned rather than awake. Obfuscate is another interesting choice. It will make all of your sacreds stealthy, a very potent skill to have in that now that all of your leaders, bar your basic Mound Kings, can be stealth, and moved around with Lictor strike groups to effectively elf your opponent. It won't affect your regular undead forces, they will still be seen as normal, but it can give you the element of surprise and let you only fight in battles that you want to fight in. A Quickness Bless, though expensive, is another potential choice. It will make your Lictors terrifying on the battlefield, each of them having 2 attacks or 6 per square of them, will let them effectively destroy any normal units and heavily damage elite ones. Given that you're probably going magic skills anyway, it's not going to stop your Hell Bless as well, but it is reliant on a few pretender choices so that it's not a crippling investment of your design points. Awe is another potential choice, making all of your sacreds far harder to hit in combat. This is especially useful on your knights, who with their hit points can't really take a hard hit. Giving your enemies a chance to not strike will mean they last longer, the same with things like your Wailing Ladies, due to the low protection. It doesn't solve the issue that you'll have in the main way that your sacreds will die though, which is through mass banishment or undead clearers however. Okay, let's move on to some example pretenders. As always, this kind of goes with the way that I think about the nation, so you design at home whatever you want. This is more just to try and get you thinking about what you could potentially use as a pretender. If you want to go full scales Ermor, you certainly can, and who knows, you might get a funny story out of it. First of all, we have the Awake Trinity, a Titan of the Crossroads with 5 Astral and Death, and 3 in Nature, with an Arcane Finesse, Stygian Flesh, and Resilient Bless. For their scales, they have 7 Dominion, 2 in Turmoil, 2 in Sloth, 2 in Cold, 4 Death, 1 Luck, and 2 in Magic. These paths sound good, but they are Trinity pretenders, so they're split unequally among them. So you'll have one with 4 Astral, Death 3, Nature 1, another one with 3 in Astral and Death, Nature 2, and the last with Astral 3, Death 4, and Nature 1. You do get some benefits from this god, however, in that you have a fairly decent early bless with Stygian Flesh and Resilient in order to make your Sacred Knights a little tankier, with an Arcane Finesse bless for later research for your mages. More importantly, you have 3 Pretender chassis to help you defend Ermor in the early game against rushes, and for the potential for mass summoning of your mages and lictors when you have some more death income. With some research and a little bit of gear to bump up their protection, these 3 ladies can be a nightmare to deal with, at least until better research comes online. They can help you expand as well, though you do have to be a little bit more careful about who you send them to fight, especially if you start to split them up where they will lose a lot of their magical power. Still, slap something on them like Twist Fate, Personal Regeneration, so a Skeletal Body, that kind of thing, and they can go to town on independence. Next up we have the Awake Understatue, a statue of the underworld with Death 6, Astral and Glamour 5, and Fire 3, with a Reforming and Stygian Flesh and 2 times Magic Resistance Bless. For his scales he has 8 Dominion, the worst everywhere else, and 1 in Fortune and Magic. Slightly worse in terms of scales than before. Before this you have an Awake Immobile with high Dominion and some nice cross paths. His main job will be to summon a single Dusk Elder and then probably just research for a while to get you the magic research you need in order to defend your lands. He isn't able to move normally, but he can do some teleport shenanigans if required, and given his good protection, high hit points and piercing and slashing resistance, he's actually pretty tanky. Later in the game, he's a high astral caster and he's able to forge you Starshine Caps, and the main reason for this build, which is Rings of the False Pretender with his Glamour and Fire Paths. The next pretender is the Awake Quickness Geyser, a Sacred Geyser with Water 9, Death 4, Fire 3, and a Fire Resistance attack skill and Quickness Bless with Dominion 8, Turmoil, Sloth and Cold 2, Death 4, Fortune 1, and Magic 2. This pretender is stronger in the sense that they're able to prevent your capital from falling. The Sacred Geyser is a very tanky pretender that most armies will struggle to defeat early, even though he can't actually move out to defend your capital province, which is a bit of a shame. The Quickness Bless on top of the attack skill will make your Sacreds able to chew through regular troops, especially your knights who get an extra attack for themselves and their mount. This is especially true when you start to add things like Undead Power on top of this. It's a massive swing and attack skill for your troops. Your Pretender is pretty decent at research, and is also capable of summoning both your Archbishops and your Dusk Elders without any additional research for boosters. Next up we have the Dormant Magic Fountain, a fountain of blood with 7 blood, 6 death and astral, 3 for earth, with a blood vengeance, reforming flesh, blood surge and undying bless, with 8 dominion, 3 turmoil, 2 sloth, 2 cold, 4 death, 1 fortune and 3 in magic. With this pretender, you're sacrificing some of your early game power for a better mid to late game once they're out. 3 magic is to help your research, which you will need as you're stuck with bishops and spectators until the fountain is out, or until you get Skull Staff, whichever one comes first. This does leave you slightly vulnerable to early rushes. especially given that half of your bless is incarnate, so it's not going to be active until your god awakes. Still, they're only dormant, so they'll awake sometime after the first year, and when they do, the combination of reforming flesh and blood vengeance can be quite scary. The blood surge will be active fairly regularly, and it will help your knights a fair amount. They'll usually kill a target on the charge with their lance attack, so it triggers fairly reliably. In terms of magic, you also have a decent death and astral caster for globals and for rituals, with a little bit of earth for some cross paths. The blood levels are slightly wasted, but if you are able to get a lot of blood slaves somehow, through trading for example, then you could start to summon vampires when you get the research going, giving you a little bit more late game variety. Not really something to be relied on though. Next we have the Imprisoned good stuff. A Frost Father with 5 in Astral, 4 in Fire, Air, Water, Earth, Glamour and Blood, and 3 in Death and Nature. For his Bless, he's a 4 times Undying, 3 times Magic Resistance, Shock and Fire Resistance, Arcane Finesse, Enchanted Blood, Blood Surge, with 8 Dominion, 2 Turmoil, Sloth, Cold, 4 in Death, 1 in Fortune and 2 in Magic. I don't really like this Pretender, to be honest. You're sacrificing the option of starting to summon Dusk Elders until you get Construction 5, which you have no chance of your god being able to help. This Bless is fairly nice. Your Sacreds do like it for the small amount of regen on top of the extra 4 magic resistance and the little bit of killing power they get through Blood Surge, but you're going to be waiting too long for your god to help you with all of his magic paths. If you were going to go for this kind of Pretender or Bless, I'd potentially say go with more of a specialised rather than a full rainbow and take him Dormant, so at least then he can try and help with summons or forging for when you get attacked by your neighbours. With this build, at least he does come out later in the game and give you a bunch of magical diversity for you to use to try and win the game with him, including casting some big globals or getting a bunch of magical gems. Okay, that's a look into Middle Age Ermor, the nation that, when I think of dominions at least, is forefront in my mind. They've touched nearly every other nation in the lore, and their decisions have changed the fate of the Dominions universe. Maybe you will be able to finish what they started, and with them, wipe out all life. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, consider becoming a member of the Burger Band for early access to videos when they're uploaded, as well as some additional benefits. But whether you do or don't, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. Until next time, take care. Spooky, scary skeletons send shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul and seal your doom tonight. Spooky, 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 oh they're so spooky, skeletons.